Welcome to episode 11 of Project Stresa, a timeline which starts at the point of divergence of Austria being admitted into Germany in 1919. The Latin axis begins to splinter into two, with the Eurasian states aligning themselves with Moscow, and the European members aligning themselves to Washington, at an extreme cost. Franco and Mussolini both found themselves dead, and Larocque adopted a democracy to save himself from a similar fate. The ideal of a limited peace of the Saxon Allies became the most preferred option among the members of the Latin Axis, while the Comintern continued to strive for the world revolution. The Saxon Allies are now without their major oil-producing sectors thanks to the southern thrust of the Soviets succeeding, and the betrayal of Iraq. Now, their only option is to perform a daring land invasion from Anatolia to India, aptly named Operation Alexander, and invade the Soviet homelands to divert their troops away from the Middle East, Operation Barbarossa. The invasion manages to capture local forces off guard, while not nearly as effective initially as our history, as the element of surprise is far less than a surprise declaration of war. The desperate attack of the Saxon Allies was a gamble that they could not have predicted. Due to Finland's strategic position in the north, the Saxon Allies were able to coordinate a quick blitz to Leningrad, encircling troops in Estonia and threatening an encirclement of the city itself. These advances are truly unprecedented, and it had taken the experience of the German army in their successful and failed operations of the war in the west to its fullest extent in the east. But what has made their advance so much more effective in the Germans in our history is due to one major factor. The local populations are much more willing to collaborate with democracies rather than fascists. In our timeline, despite how false it was if you had read his book, Hitler was seen as a liberator to the non-Russians of the Soviet Union. However, those ignorant of Hitler's ambitions would soon understand his intentions as, they did things I can't talk about here. Since the Polish had occupied a large majority of regions that they had ambitions towards in the past, many in Poland had wished to claim these territories for their state. However, that would go against the Germans' preferred outcome of having an independent Ukraine. Kiev had been managed to be captured by the Saxon Allies a long time ago, and due to the prowess of the Ukrainians, had managed to withhold the Soviet advance well beforehand. Now, the Saxon Allies had managed to push well beyond the Dnieper. Many Ukrainians had hoped for an independent state. However, due to the aforementioned ambitions of the Polish, they had sought to integrate the Ukrainians into their Międzymorze, under the ambitions of the legendary general Pilduski. As the Saxon Allies comprised of the remaining members of the League of Nations, they had sought to fulfill the ideal of self-determination for all peoples, and these Polish ambitions were, to many, failed attempts of achieving their irredentism. However, the Saxon Allies are well aware of the consequences of not providing your allies their claimed lands, as Italy had fallen to fascism after their mutilated victory. A compromise had to be made for the continued collaboration of the Polish and Germans. The Germans were willing to provide Poland their ambitions to integrate the Ukrainians, but many measures had to be taken before this would be permitted. For one, the Polish would need to provide the reforms necessary for such a large demographic change to not lead to destabilization to occur. Much to the dismay of Polish nationalists, the minorities of their nation were given substantial rights in anticipation of the annexation of these large territories. But yet another concession had to be made. Germany's claimed lands must be conceded back to them. To many in Poland, this was unacceptable for many reasons, but the primary one was that they were radically devoted to the ideal of Poland, and the idea of allowing their lands to be partitioned under any circumstance was seen as a bridge too far. The Germans were well aware of this. It would attempt to alleviate Polish concerns of the reclamation of Prussian lands by retracting their claim to Poznan, and instead only wished to reclaim Danzig in its entirety. If the Polish were to do this, the Germans would recognize the Polish claim to their Międzymorze and provide them the occupation of Lithuania as their new Baltic port. The negotiations were tense, but in the end, the Germans reclaimed Danzig and the Polish proclaimed the Międzymorze. This proclamation had deeply upset the Ukrainian nationalists who had been fighting vehemently on the Saxon Allies' side up until this point, with the expectation of an independent state. However, this resistance would not amount to much, and the Saxon Allied advance into Russia would continue. Along their warpath, those who would defect from the Soviets to the Germans, like Andrei Vlasov in our history, would do the same in this timeline. And another very prominent Russian would support the Germans fully in this timeline, rather than only under duress. Vladimir III, Krylevich of Russia. Vladimir III was one of the only remaining Romanov claimants to the throne of Russia after the Bolshevik execution of the royal family. In our history, he would speak words of support for the German invasion of the USSR. However, when the Germans had demanded that he issue a manifesto encouraging Russian emigres to support the Nazi invasion of the USSR, he refused. This is most likely due to the fact that he would have been against their designs on his homeland. In this timeline, the Germans' only goal is the destruction of Bolshevism, not the elimination of Russia and those who call it home. Therefore, in this timeline, when the Germans would request his influence in the war against the USSR, he would accept. With all these Russian collaborators on the side of the Saxon Allies, they would have an easier time occupying the region than our history. However, there were still countless of citizens of the USSR who had been relentlessly fighting for and vehemently believed in the ideal of communism. So the Saxon Allies would still face significant resistance, even if it was slightly diminished. While the war in the southern Atlantic was progressing, the remaining Latin American nations who had not aligned themselves with either faction were eventually swayed by America to turn on the British and their allies. The Venezuelans joined the Latin Axis in exchange for their claims in Guyana and against the Dutch to be recognized, leading to the Latin Axis declaring war on the Dutch and the Dutch joining the Saxon Allies. The Caribbean outposts were quickly occupied as the last European colony in the Caribbean had come under America's influence. The Saxon Allies' gamble of supporting a liberal Brazil was beginning to fail. In order to attempt to gain a better strategic position and extra support, Britain had offered the Falklands back to Argentina in exchange for their participation of the war on their side. However, the Argentinians had no confidence in the Saxon Allies to win their war. Instead, they joined the Latin Axis, ensuring the demise of the liberal resistance in Brazil and the seizure of the Falklands back to Argentina. With the success of Barbarossa, the Soviets were desperate for any US assistance in order to aid their war effort. Due to the occupations of Japan and the Saxon Allies' control of the Bosphorus Straits and the Baltic Sea, the only remaining naval port that would be able to accept US shipments is Arkhangelsk. As mentioned in a previous episode, the German U-boats were restricting this possibility. However, now the Americans had Greenland under their occupation, they would invade Iceland, enabling the stationing of their navies in Reykjavik for easier convoy protection and a much more favorable position for a naval invasion of the British Isles. British anxiety would increase as their enemies were slowly closing in on their homeland. But their navy had been concentrated in the defense of the homeland instead of being spread all over the world, so they were prepared to intercept any form of invasion. In order to best ensure the defense of their homeland, they would need to defeat the US Atlantic Navy. The fighting was close, but with the strategic positioning of Britain and Norway allowing for air support to not be dictated by carrier ships, the US Navy was forced to retreat. The Saxon Allies would continue to dominate the Northern Sea, and the Soviets were without any meaningful support. While the Saxon Allies would celebrate their victory, the Americans would execute another plan in order to assist their allies. While the Americans were not able to directly support the Soviets, they would support them indirectly by executing a large invasion of France. Supported by a naval invasion in the western coast of France, the Americans would push the Free French government all the way to the Seine. While the Saxon Allies had anticipated this maneuver and had made appropriate countermeasures, they did not anticipate the sheer strength of the American forces. Another factor to the Latin Axis' benefit was the Latin Axis aligned partisans. Yes, ironically enough, the resistance would face resistance, especially after Larocque had promised democratic elections again. The previously united resistance movement of restoring democracy had suddenly turned on the Free French government, seeing them as collaborators to the Germans and wished to ensure the sovereignty of the French state. With the brutal strength of the Americans, now with their sphere of influence in Europe secure with the liberalization of their European allies, it had seemed to many that the fate of the Saxon Allies was secured. However, the fate of Europe would be in the hands of the American voters, as the election between the pro-war Democrats and anti-war Republicans was looming. Henry Wallace and his Democrats would face Dewey and his Republicans in a presidential election. While the socialist movement had grown significantly, Norman Thomas had advised all socialists to vote for Dewey, as by doing so, they would prevent more bloodshed and ensure that the Democrats, who had begun to grow a fascist sympathetic wing of their party, would not gain any more influence over America. While Roosevelt had been extremely popular and the longest acting president in the history of the United States, he was barely voted out in the 1944 elections. This was extremely unprecedented, as the American populace had never voted out a president during wartime. However, Roosevelt is not the Democratic nominee. Henry Wallace was, and he was not nearly as popular as his predecessor. Due to all these factors, Dewey would win in the 1944 elections and become president-elect. During the transitional period before Dewey's ascension to presidency, the American armies in the European War would stand by as a measure of goodwill prior to peace negotiations between the Americans and the European Saxon Allies. But would the British and Germans really consider selling out their Japanese ally? Would the Americans even consider granting their occupied lands back to the British? Would France and Italy become whole again? All of these questions and more will be answered in episode 12 of Project Stresa, where the peace negotiations begin.